Hello, everybody, and welcome. We're still waiting for a few people to arrive, but I'm just going to do the introduction. So welcome to the December installment of Ben's Book Club, which is a monthly virtual gathering looking at themes relating to Benjamin Franklin, the 18th century, and American history and culture. This month, we're going to be taking a festive break by talking to George Goodwin, our Benjamin Franklin House author in residence, about his book Christmas Traditions, an entertaining and enlightening guide to the sacred and secular traditions of Christmas. George Goodwin is, of course, our author in residence at Benjamin Franklin House in London, a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and a Macon Fellow at the British Library's Eccles Center for American Studies. As well as being the author of Christmas Traditions that we're talking about today, George has written 3 highly acclaimed historical studies, which include Benjamin Franklin, London, the British Life, American Founding Father. So welcome, George.
Thank you very much indeed, Caitlin. It's great to be here, and I'm very much looking forward to our chat. Now, I better start off actually by talking about this slide and why this talk is in association with the Eccles Center. It's because the book Christmas Traditions is published by the British Library. And I'm actually, as Caitlin said, I'm a fellow of the Eccles Center. And of course, I wanted to show you the cover so that you can rush off, but don't rush to Amazon because they've sold out. So you can rush off and buy my book. But I thought you'd actually like to see that image, which I was delighted when the picture researcher discovered this photograph of some 1930s Christmas wrapping paper. And I thought it made the absolute ideal cover. I'm very, very pleased with it. Now, Caitlin, you had some questions.
I do. And I was just going to say, we have a copy of the book here at Benjamin Franklin House. So I do say it is great for the holiday season. So please, on our website, there's actually www.benjaminfranklinhouse.org. There are links to where to buy the book. The first question that I have for you is kind of what inspired you to write this book?
Well, actually, partly because the Eccles Center has the most tremendous, or rather the British Library has the most tremendous collection of illustrative material. But so that was one thought. But another thought was that I do write books on transatlantic history, and I was very interested in sort of the transatlantic element of Christmas and researching that and doing more with it. Because, I mean, people think of the traditional English Christmas, this sort of the Victorian Christmas in the country. And of course, that really so this is the image, old Christmas. There is the footman, a very well-fed footman, with his Christmas pudding and lots of sort of foaming beer down there. And you think, oh, right, well, this must have been from an English author who sort of wrote this and if you like, sort of proselytized the idea of Christmas. But in fact, wasn't English at all. It was Washington Irving, who of course is better known for, better known now for Rip Van Winkle and Sleepy Hollow. But, in some ways, people have forgotten about him a bit. But in the 19th century, he was, one of America's best-selling authors. And what he did was he was actually in Britain just after the Napoleonic Wars. And he sort of recreated the idea of Christmas and, things such as the boar's head being carried in. I mean, basically nobody did that anymore. And he actually had quite a lot of traditions, which he mentioned that he basically created. But it got across the idea that, Christmas was something to be enjoyed for festive fun for children. And it really sort of started a role for how the 19th century Christmas would be celebrated. And of course, it was picked up by this chap. Now, who do we think this chap is on the left? Because we're used to seeing him as a very old, well, he actually wasn't very old, but a very old-looking man. But Caitlin, do you have any ideas? Because actually, this is a very, very well, it's not a very well-known portrait.
Well, we've had somebody say it, but I agree. I think it's Dickens. Is that correct?
It is indeed Dickens. And this is a portrait by Francis Alexander of Boston, who is the portrait of Dickens from his 1842 to 43 tour of America. And this is the young Taro, who of course had written the Pickwick Papers already, and the Old Curiosity Shop, and Oliver Twist. And of course, I've got a scene from illustration for the Pickwick Papers at the bottom. Now, there was actually quite a firm link between Charles Dickens and Washington Irving. In fact, you had a sort of a three-way link, because Washington Irving was a great fan of Sir Walter Scott, and he even went up to Abbotsford up in Scotland in the Borders to see him, and they got on like a house on fire. And Dickens read Washington Irving, and he wrote to him, I mean, like a sort of fan letter, if you like, saying that, you know, he wanted to be with Washington Irving on the outside of the coach going to Bracebridge Hall, which was the hall on which Washington Irving based his Christmas fiction, if you like. But I have to say, looking at that one at the top, I'm not sure that I would fancy being on the outside of the coach at all. So here we are. Now, of course, I've got something else which I think you might be interested in here. Right, okay. So this is 19th century Father Christmas. In fact, I think the one on the left it was originally a German figure, but it sort of gets across the idea. So where's the red? There's no red. They're sort of different colors. They're blue, they're green, they're purple, they're brown, they're any kind of color. And it's not a lot of presents, you know, on the left, sort of a bit sort of dangly from his belt, and on the right, just a few presents. And this was actually the sort of traditional English Father Christmas figure, who really wasn't the great present giver that we know today. In fact, I should mention that the first description or personification, if you like, of Father Christmas was in 1616. As late as that, there was an earlier 15th century Christmas carol where Christmas as a person gets a mention, but it's kind of like a sort of cursory mention. This was a full-blooded Christmas masque for King James I of Britain, and it was written by Ben Jonson, and it was staged by Inigo Jones, the great architect, but also he was a great scene master, if you like. And they introduced this figure called Captain Christmas, or Christmas of London, or Old Gregory Christmas. Basically, he was introduced to mock the Puritan approach to Christmas, which was basically no Christmas. And so Father Christmas, as he became known, but we'll still call him Captain Christmas, he had 10 children. So we had all these 10 children were introduced, and they all had things such as carol. Puritans didn't like that. Wassailing, which was the sort of form of people would come to your door with a disgusting drink and quote a couple of verses at you, expect you to drink the disgusting drink, and of course give them money. Then they had a thing called mumming, which is basically, you know, just like mummers today. People who would come disguised, you wouldn't know whether they were your neighbors and family or whether they were strangers, and they'd come and do a little play for you. Because the fact that they were, you didn't know who they were, could lead to a bit of crime, as you can expect. So those were the wassailing and mumming were two traditions. I think the Puritans had a point, but they certainly didn't have a point at attacking things such as the mince pie. That was another of Captain Christmas's children, and baby cake, which was the sort of the predecessor of Christmas cake, because their idea of Christmas, as I said, was one of no Christmas. And of course, the perfect no Christmas, which I found, was one described by no less than Governor William Bradford of the Pilgrim Fathers. It was the first Christmas on land in 1621, because of course 1620 Christmas was still on board ship, because they hadn't really had a chance to land, being so cold when they arrived, hadn't had a chance to land properly and build houses. But 1621, Christmas arrived, and of course there were some newcomers, who joined the Pilgrim Fathers, and they didn't quite sort of get what the Christmas of the founding of the Plymouth Brethren should be about, because they decided that they weren't going to do what William Bradford and co did on Christmas Day, which was go to work. And so they stayed at home. But they came back, or rather Bradford and co came back at lunchtime and found these non-workers. They were playing games. They were tossing the caber. They were playing a sort of version of stool ball, which they're playing stool ball, which is kind of like a version of cricket and baseball. So what he did was he actually took their bats and balls away, and he said, it was against his conscience that they weren't actually studying the Bible at home, and that was the proper way to enjoy Christmas. But of course, in the 19th century, as I said, Christmas started to be celebrated, and we can thank our American friends for the invention of Santa Claus. And this is almost the Santa Claus that we know today. This was the Santa Claus version of Thomas Nast. This is a later colorization, but he did in the original printings, he did actually have Father Christmas in red. And this is really just taking it to the furthest degree. Now, I gave a talk last night, and I did get the question of, was it Coca-Cola who put Father Christmas in red? And I have to say, no, it wasn't. I mean, it was another artist, an Australian actually, but he was still working in New York, called Frank Nankerville, who first illustrated him really wearing the absolute modern kit that we know, and that was in 1902. And the great Coca-Cola artists, Haddon Sundblom and Norman Rockwell, they were children. And actually Coca-Cola, the first advertisement for Coca-Cola was 29 years after the Nankerville. It was in 1931. So, and finally, actually, I mean, the great thing about Santa Claus was here's the Christmas present bringer. Christmas is all about presents for children, and it took off. I mean, from sort of the 1870s, it quickly spread around the world. And I was really interested to find this one. And I thought, oh, it's a Japanese Father Christmas. He's wearing all the kit. I wonder what the date is. It's 1914. I found that absolutely amazing, that, the whole Santa Claus coming on Christmas Eve had got to Japan so early. And as you can imagine, I did actually get the Japanese translated, because I wanted to absolutely make sure what it was about. And it is the little girl saying, "Oh, I can't imagine if there is Santa Claus. This is absolutely, oh yes, I'm so looking forward to my presents." So that's a very long-winded answer to your first question, but I hope that it does answer it.
Absolutely. I mean, I was surprised about the Coca-Cola part because for as long as I can remember, that's the story that I've been told, that the reason why Santa is in red is because of the adverts. So, so it kind of dovetails into my next question, which why do you think Christmas has stimulated such creativity over the years from the different depictions that you've seen in your research and such?
Well, I think that's a very good question, because in a sense you actually have to go back to basics. And what is the significance of the 25th of December? Well, it's the midwinter festival. And in fact, interestingly, when Julius Caesar decided that the Roman calendar needed sorting out to pinpoint exactly which was the shortest day, he called in astronomers. He actually called in astrologers, but we'll forgive him for that. And they decided that the 25th of December was the shortest day, and it probably was then. And of course, it's moved with the centuries to slightly earlier now. But so the 25th of December was the shortest day. It fitted very well with Roman Saturnalia, which was between the 17th and the 23rd of December. So it was a sort of slight follow-on from that. But it carried on that they later, I mean, the Romans were great at importing gods from abroad. And they, by the 4th century, they had a well-established festival for Sol Invictus, the god of the unconquered sun. And that was on the 25th of December as well. So the thought obviously is that, right, the 25th of December, when Christianity came along, all they did then was they wanted to convert everybody. So let's just slap the birth of Christ, the date of the birth of Christ, let's just pop it on top of the standard midwinter festival. And it didn't actually quite work out like that, because the early Christians didn't really want to tie in with these heathens at all. I mean, the reason they went for the 25th of December was nothing to do with the pagan festival. It was to do with the fact that, and this comes into your sort of creativity bit, it came to the fact that the important date was the 25th of March, the Annunciation, when obviously the angel Gabriel came along and told Mary the good news. And of course, the 25th of December, and of course the reason for that was that it was the spring equinox that was important, not the winter solstice, the spring equinox of the 25th of March. And of course, the 25th of December is 9 months later. So hence the 25th of December. But actually, having said that, 597, St. Augustine came over here with orders from Gregory the Great, Pope Gregory the Great, saying, okay, well, we're really well established now with the Christmas festival. Let's actually convert all the heathens in Kent by taking on some of their traditions. But the deal is that they all have to be baptized. And there was a massive baptism on Christmas Day, 597. So it was kind of like a deal. Perhaps they should be negotiating our trade deal with Europe. But it certainly worked in 597. But again, I mean, talking about here we are. This is ancient Rome with Saturnalia, and this is Yule, another, of course, midwinter festival that was introduced. We think actually it was probably introduced into Britain by the Danish Viking invaders around about the sort of the 9th century. But you have the Yule Log, which don't know whether you have the Yule Log in America, the modern version. Do you have it in America? There is a Yule Log, which is actually just a Swiss roll, just a sort of chocolate-covered sort of roly cake thing. But I don't know, it's probably not an American thing, is it?
I think it depends where you are in America, but I think that's more of a European tradition generally.
I think so. Sounds like it. You know, it's like it's one of those things which, because British traditions. I don't think pantomime has never really done it in America either, has it?
No, that's definitely very English.
Yeah, it's sort of that, but actually that does go back to ancient Rome, because part of the Saturnalia, you had sort of massive cross-dressing and stuff. So with pantomime, with the actually we don't have the principal boy. The principal boy in British pantomimes always used to be a girl, but now it's normally some pop star, and he says dismissively. And of course, you have the pantomime dame is always a bloke, but you know, obviously hasn't caught on. So obviously probably one reason why the Americans do think we Brits are just a little bit weird, but there we go. So now, talking about creativity, this is the, I actually took this from New York, but you know, one thing that was sort of created is the idea of the nativity scene, and the nativity play also, and the Christmas pageant all sort of stem from this. Actually, it was St. Francis of Assisi who first kicked off with the nativity play. That was sort of around about 1223. But so he was the one, when we're talking about creativity, he was the one who created that. And as for the first Christmas Carol, another interesting thing where you had an existing sort of tradition of a carol, which comes from the Greek choros, which is basically a sort of a group singing and dancing. Actually, the first English carol was it was in the reign of King John, and that was not religious. That was basically again, it was a kind of sort of drinking song, very secular in nature. It had sort of the approach that you should give drink to your neighbor until he sleeps by day. So it was kind of very much a secular one. The first religious one came slightly later. That was around about the I think it was if I remember rightly, it was actually in the 14th century, and it was basically saying it was called Christ is Born, and the Christmas Carol really took off after that. And here we are. Here's another nativity scene. What I actually find really interesting is that we have the depiction, and you're talking again about creativity. Obviously, so much religious art is based on the birth of Jesus, and this is actually one I particularly like. Is a Hans Memling from 1470, and what is interesting, again, when I was talking about creativity, it's a sort of the blend of the religious and the secular, because the person who paid for the painting, you would actually think that it would be this guy here. Here's the guy who looks as if he's got the most amazing tattoo. Actually, it's not. It's obviously gold thread, and he's obviously the one with loads and loads of dosh. Here is the sort of it's a 3-generational thing. Here's the older generation. This is the sort of the man in prime of life. And this is the younger man. And it was quite common to have people from the 3 different then known continents, from Europe, from Asia, and from Africa. And in fact, the first African appearing in a nativity scene was as early as there's a painting in Prague, and that's from 1360. So really, really quite early. But actually, the guy who paid for the painting, he's over here. He's looking on at his creation. Other creativity here have the most wonderful Rubens, which is behind the altar in this place, which is King's College Chapel, Cambridge. Here they are singing below. And this is actually another nice Anglo-American thing, because I understand that every year more than 300 American radio stations take the service live. And so I have to say that we tend to listen in as well. And finally, creativity, the great sort of 19th century celebrations. Here we have the Christmas cracker. Now this actually had quite an interesting, I mean, a lot of things are created sort of accidentally. We've heard about the vaccine over here, the Oxford AstraZeneca one, where they've accidentally found, well, they found that if they actually only used half a dose in the first of the two vaccinations, and that was done by accident, they find it's more effective. And this was another accident with the Christmas cracker. There was a man called Tom Smith who sold sweets. Well, in fact, they were sugared almonds, and these sugar almonds were wrapped up. And he was sitting by the fire thinking, and he was thinking, how can I sell these sugar almonds more successfully? And he heard a crackle in the fire, and they sort of recently invented these strips that have a cracking sound. So he put one of these in with all his sugar almonds wrapped up, and it worked a treat. In fact, by the within about a decade, it was, oh, well, we'll drop the sugar almonds and we'll just sell the crackers. And that was in the 1840s. And again, in the 1840s, the first Christmas card. And this was from a gentleman who was so busy that he couldn't do the standard thing of writing letters. So he actually created this card, which he could just sign. And that sort of set us off for Christmas cards from that point. Then, of course, they're becoming certainly less popular over here because they're so expensive to post. But anyway, so that's I hope that is that question answered.
Yes, thank you. It is very interesting how much creativity has come from this holiday. And I'm sure that you saw many different things in your research. And I was wondering kind of what your favorite Christmas tradition that you came across in your research.
Well, before I do that, I think I mean, everybody, well, I hope everybody has their own favorite Christmas tradition, which they do every year. Well, certainly we do in this family. And we've been doing it, I think, for over 20 years now. And so there's it's on Christmas Eve, this particular one. And we sit down and we have a meal of baked ham and parsley sauce. But much more importantly, we all sit down and we watch perhaps one of the greatest films ever made. And I mean, of course, The Muppet Christmas Carol. It's absolutely superb. And we're in very good company, actually, because the previous Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, he declared that it was his favorite film. And I thought, this is a man of great taste and judgment. So that's our favorite. But the thing that I found was, now this young chap here, he is a modern, and I thought that I knew about this tradition of, it's called the boy bishop. And I thought that it had died, but it's been recreated and reintroduced in England and in America and in Spain. And basically it goes back to medieval times when from St. Nicholas's Day, the 6th of December, and St. Nicholas was the if you like, the precursor of Santa Claus, because it went St. Nicholas and then into the Dutch Sinterklaas and then into Santa Claus. So from St. Nicholas's Day, which is the 6th of December, to the 28th, which is Holy Innocents' Day, the church, or certain sees of the church would appoint boy bishops for their cathedrals, and these were kind of they were put in charge, and they were able to preach, and they were able to run things. So it was sort of going back to the Romans, the idea of a kind of lord and misrule, sort of the world turned upside down. And so this was it was quite common actually in medieval England. Sometimes, of course, the actual bishops decided that they didn't really like it too much, because you can imagine the amount of absolute chaos that could be created in this period of just sort of 3 weeks. And so they were banned, but they came back again, and actually they were finally banned by Henry VIII when he took over as head of the Church of England. So he thought, well, it's okay for the Pope to allow this, but this is my church now, and I don't like it. So he got rid of it. He kept at court, he had laws of misrule, and he also, or certainly his father did, Henry VII, and so did James IV of Scotland, who was king at the same time. They had abbots of unreason as well as the lords of misrule. And again, they would sort of create sort of mad court festivities over the Christmas period. So I was delighted to see that they had been reintroduced. But in fact, they're not only boy bishops now, there are girl bishops too. And so they're not called boy bishops anymore, because they're called chorister bishops, because the bishops were always chosen from the cathedral choirs.
And I think I read in your book as well that this sort of tradition has kind of carried on in other parts of society. So I think it said is it in the Navy or the Army where they do that sometimes as well, where they have the officers serve the. That's
right. Well, absolutely. I mean, in the armed forces, again, it's on Christmas Day, both actually here in Britain and also in America. The forces. The person who, or the officer in charge, will serve the men. In fact, all the officers serve the men, and for one day a year, they are served by the people who they have to report to. My father was in the RAF, and I would think actually, from what he said to me, the best food at RAF stations was in the airman's mess, because I suppose it was sort of quantity and bulk buying that they could actually do much more with the budget. So I expect the officers probably enjoyed the food as well.
That's really interesting. And as I mentioned before, I was surprised about the fact that Santa Claus wasn't the modern Santa wasn't invented by Coca-Cola, but did anything kind of surprise you in your research? Anything that in terms of what you saw in your research to do with these Christmas traditions?
Well, this surprised me greatly, because this is the first, if you like, illustration of Santa Claus. Now, as I said, I think I said about Washington Irving creating this idea of the English country Christmas. Well, he also created the idea of Santa Claus, and that goes back to a joke. I mean, basically, in sort of around about in fact, the early 19th century, in New York, the New York Historical Society, or prominent members of, were trying to create all kinds of traditions for this new city. They were thinking, right, we need to come up with new cities that kind of give us some almost sort of cultural foundation stones. So Washington Irving, in his book Deirdre Knickerbocker's History of New York, invented some for them, and it included having St. Nicholas flying over Manhattan and this is the crucial bit, in his wagon which he customarily brings presents for children, because that's what St. Nicholas traditionally did in Holland. Actually, he'd also bring a birch for bad children, but we'll ignore that at the moment. And so that sort of caught on. And St. Nicholas, obviously, Sinterklaas, the Dutch word for St. Nicholas, and it was picked up. It became sort of people said, "Oh right, oh well, this is a very nice," and it was the children aspect which was important, because Christmas had been seen pretty much as a sort of a time for adult festivity. But as I said before, I mean, Washington Irving later on also in his Bracebridge Christmases had the idea of, well, this is a time for children. And it was picked up by Clement Clarke Moore, who in his poem best known as 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, he showed the visit on Christmas Eve, no longer on St. Nicholas's Day, on Christmas Eve, with this nice elfin Santa. And in the same year, we had this illustration in a rather appalling poem, but we have a kind of mutant Santa Claus, but here he is called Santy Claus. And I hadn't seen this before, 1821. Here he is well, he's got a red coat, he's got one reindeer, and he's got rewards, so he's got his presents. And in fact, in the same poem, the poet couldn't quite, or a poet illustrator couldn't quite make up his mind. We don't know who it was, by the way, because he has a red Santa Claus and he has a green Santa Claus. It's rather like sort of changing traffic lights. He also has the birch, which Clement Clarke Moore had dropped. So this was actually the thing that, if you like, sort of surprised me the most. I was absolutely delighted to find it, because if you like, it was another brick in the road as far as the story was concerned.
It's really interesting how everything kind of connects to create the kind of the modern myths that we have today around Christmas. But I just wanted to ask you, as we are Benjamin Franklin House, there had to be one Benjamin Franklin related question. How would Benjamin Franklin have celebrated the holiday in the 18th century during his time?
And by magic, of course, I have the great David Martin portrait of Benjamin Franklin in London. Now, probably his most important Christmas was in Christmas 1773, because on Christmas Day itself, and in fact, I mean, it was quite, as I said, I mean, it was the 19th century who really resurrected Christmas after, the Puritans. You had a sort of jolly medieval Christmases, and then the Puritans came in and put the dampers on, and it really didn't sort of become jolly again. And again, as I said, more sort of child-focused until the 1840s. So, I mean, it's quite common for him to sit down and write his letters. Now, on Christmas Day, 1773, he wrote a letter to the newspapers saying, "It was me. I was the person who leaked those letters purportedly coming from Thomas Hutchinson, and they were letters to Andrew Oliver. Thomas Hutchinson, who was governor of Massachusetts, and Andrew Oliver was his deputy. And these letters basically were interpreted as saying that they really wanted to kibosh the Charter of Massachusetts and really bring in sort of more arbitrary government at the expense of the House of Representatives." And this was actually important because when the letters had been leaked, and he sent them over to his chum in the House of Representatives, Thomas Cushing, didn't really, I mean, he could be quite careless, Benjamin Franklin, a genius of a man, but he could be quite careless. And so he sent them to Thomas Cushing, saying, just show them to a few people. Well, one of those few people was Sam Adams, who thought, right, well, the better deal here is to get the things published. And but the reason why he admitted that he'd leaked them was because there were two prime suspects for leaking the letters rather than Franklin, and they blamed each other and they'd fought a duel. And fortunately, these two were absolutely hopeless at dueling. They'd fired pistols at each other and missed. And then they tried to attack each other with swords, and basically ended up with them just kind of scrabbling around in the mud. I mean, one got sort of slightly wounded. But Franklin had heard that this disaster was going to be repeated, and the danger was one actually might kill the other this time. So he decided it was probably about time that I owned up to it. So he said that he'd leaked it, and this wasn't actually going to matter that much, except it was one of the points that sort of came up when he appeared before the Privy Council, asking as the representative of Massachusetts to get Hutchinson and Oliver removed. But the meeting came exactly after it became known in Britain about the Boston Tea Party, and he was the representative of the Assembly of House of Representatives of Massachusetts, and he had a bit of a dire time. And this was I mean, he still sort of wanted to try and keep the colonies and Britain together. But it did, of course, eventually lead to this, which is, I mean, of course, this was his own cartoon, Franklin's own cartoon in his own newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, but it kind of got reissued for the American Revolution. It was originally to get the colonies to come together to align against the French in the 1750s. But it was reintroduced. What's actually interesting here, of course, I mean, in the 1750s, and again during the Revolution, and again you've got all the colonies represented. So where's Georgia? Georgia's not there, and Georgia was late to come to the party. And of course, it's quite ironic that what's going to happen to the Senate, and of course, is going to have the most amazing impact in America for the Biden presidency is who wins those senatorial positions for Georgia.
Very topical.
I had to throw that in.
Yeah, everything leads back to Franklin, it seems.
Of course, of course.
So with that in mind, what are you currently researching and working on at the moment?
Well, I'm going to introduce this other chap here. I'm doing and this, of course, is George Washington. Well, I say of course, but I think people can guess. I mean, this is George Washington on Christmas Day, 1776. He's preparing. In fact, I think he may already have crossed the Delaware, so we're into Boxing Day. So that was probably his most important Christmas Day, because it then led, of course, to this, which is this is a Charles Wilson Peale, and it's known as the Princeton Portrait because, of course, after victory at Trenton, he then went to win the Battle of Princeton just a few days later, and that was the first real victory that he had against British regulars, and that was actually in terms of propaganda and in terms of sort of morale was obviously very important. So I'm doing a book on you won't be surprised to hear on George Washington. It's starring George Washington. It's co-starring Benjamin Franklin, and it's on the War of Independence. So I'll be one of many, I'm sure, but I've got a slightly different angle, I hope, on it. But you know, it's not going to be published for a bit, so I tend to like to keep this stuff a little bit under my hat when I'm researching. I mean, I don't go the full hog of Benjamin Franklin with my favorite Benjamin Franklin saying, 3 can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. but I'm going to sort of keep that slightly under my hat at the moment.
Well, we look forward to seeing that when it comes out eventually. And thank you for taking the time to speak to us about Christmas traditions during
Thank you.
Ben's book club. So we have some time for some questions now. And actually, while we were talking, there's been a couple that have come through. So the first one that I have is, do you know where the tradition of cracker jokes originated?
Yes, I think that again, it came from Tom Smith, because okay, you don't have the sweets anymore, or you probably have sort of sweets included, but you've got the crackers are the most important thing. So why not build it up with a few little bits and pieces? And one of the things, of course, which is so important, is the Christmas the Christmas crown, one might call it, the Christmas hat. And do you know what? One can trace that all the way back to Saturnalia, because they had the world upside down. They had the equivalent of in fact, I think it's sort of dying out now with the microwave, because we used to, I certainly remember as a child, you'd have a Christmas pudding and you'd shove some money in it. And of course, with the microwave, actually, that's a pretty stupid thing to do. Unless, of course, you put in the money afterwards. But this goes back to Saturnalia as well. But the important thing would be that they had a cake. They had a Saturnalia cake, and in it were a bean and a pea, and which would decide who would be the king of the bean and who would be the queen of the pea, and they would be if you like, the lord and lady of misrule for as long as they decided, really. I mean, a clever household would make sure that it wasn't going to be somebody who would sort of tell them to do all kinds of ludicrous things. But of course, the key thing is that they had a little crown. And of course, in our democratic age, I think it's very important that we all have crowns. So the joke and the hat, again, I think we're moving into the 1850s as the cracker became more sort of concrete, as it were.
What I also found interesting was kind of that idea of the king of the pea and the bean and all that, because it is, we often think of, there's like the king's cake where you put a little figure inside the cake, and whoever gets that ends up being the king or the queen. And so it's all linked. It's very interesting in that way. Yeah. So another question that we have is, what would you say are the conditions for creating a new tradition that would stick, that would last the generations as some have?
Well, there have been, actually, I was asked to appear on Radio London, and they said, well, we'd like you to talk about modern traditions. And I said, well, actually, I hate to tell you, I'm not really up on modern traditions. So they and I decided it probably was not sort of sensible for me to come along. But I do know some modern traditions, and for instance, there's the jumper. I understand there's the jumper exchange, and this does have a kind of a legacy, if you like, which is the standard appalling Christmas present would be you would get a jumper knitted lovingly all year by some ancient auntie, and it would turn up and it would be absolutely and utterly appalling. So this was sort of taken up in this modern tradition of people giving each other, and I think this is young people mainly, giving each other the most appalling jumper that they can find, or should we say sweater for our American friends. So that's one. Another one, which I actually quite like, having a greyhound, because I think that it would suit him. It's not one that we have. We actually we have a sort of little Christmas collar thing for him, which has a sort of little dangling bell on it, which we quite like. The bell doesn't actually sound very much. It's got a little tassel on it as well, which is rather better. But the tradition that I'm referring to is the idea of putting these kind of attaching these sort of helmety type things, which make your dog look like a reindeer. Now, I think that's a modern tradition. That's one which I quite approve of, and I think that that might last. But I mean, what about you, Caitlin? I mean, do you know of any modern traditions that that you think are going to make the cut, that are going to sort of stand in time?
That's a very good question. It's interesting that you bring up kind of the ugly jumper tradition, because it seems to be that that's in a lot of places where I've worked before, there has been an ugly jumper day where you come in to work in your ugliest Christmas jumper. And I'd be very interested to see what historians will think of that in the future, looking back at the traditions today. But I think that one might stick, just because it goes with the kind of the commercial aspect of the holiday, and that you need to buy a new jumper every year to keep up with winning the ugliest jumper contest, or raising money for charity or whatever it may be. So I look forward to seeing that in the next 10-20 years, people still doing that tradition.
Yeah, because I mean, the thing is, it is a kind of Christmas has always been, if you like, a kind of blend of the religious and the secular. I mean, if we go back to St. Augustine again, he sort of blended the religious and the secular, and it's it's part of today. I mean, on the religious side, I mean, it's going to be very interesting next year to see how many people go to church at Christmas, and I would think there will probably be quite a swell. And it's not necessarily because you have to be particularly religious, but it's actually just a nice way to start the Christmas period, because in fact we always go to midnight mass. I mean, it's the one time in the year that I make sure that I go, because I mean, basically, when we're talking about the 12 days of Christmas, the first day of Christmas is Christmas Day, of course, because Christmas Eve is the eve of the festival of Christmas. And this was another, that it should be 12 days was established by a church council, the Council of Tours. And I think that was 364, 364 that they did that. And actually some people have said that it's the 12 days of Christmas, the partridge in the pear tree, that has a long sort of established religious significance. Doesn't at all, actually. I mean, the 12 days of Christmas, it first appeared, the partridge and pear tree, etc., in a 1780s children's book called Mirths Without Mischief. And this was a memory and forfeits game. And the idea that it was all nonsense. But there was a Catholic priest who said that he'd found some ancient Irish texts that showed that it was I think this was it's later the 1990s, if I remember, showing that the 12 days of Christmas nursery rhyme really did have a religious connotation. But when he was pushed on that to reveal his sources, he said they'd actually been lost in a flood in a church crypt, which is the best kind of "the dog ate my homework" explanation that I've ever heard. So I think we just go with the 17. I know people, some people get very sort of intense about it. When I say this, they say, no, this is not true, that it's a nursery rhyme, but it is.
Well, I think what's really interesting about all these kind of Christmas traditions and these things that we know as part of the established traditions is that there is a bit of a mystical quality to it. Is it true? Is it not? Where does it come from? So in that way, it's kind of magical.
I agree. No, exactly right. Absolutely right. Yeah, and the midnight mass is, for me, is, because again, we're going back to Saturnalia, to Yule, and all the early Christmas, which was lights and evergreens. And you have evergreens in the church. You have the special, wonderful lights. Of course, you have the Christmas candle, so I mean that is something which sort of inspires, if you like, the human, the sort of human soul, because it's again, I mean, the reason for it in the beginning is that you've got the shortest day, and you're now looking forward to the longer day. So you're anticipating spring, and you bring in sort of evergreens, and you have the sort of the light to represent, I mean, Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun.
So we have time for one more question. And I think this wraps up kind of the connection between the modern and kind of the older. But do you think Christmas is as commercialized in England as it is in the US?
Well, this is actually quite an interesting one. We did have a bit of a chat about this. Well, I was actually, I haven't been in the States for Christmas, but I have been for Thanksgiving. And the day after Thanksgiving, of course, you go along to your supermarket, and what do you hear? You hear Christmas music. So in one way, I mean, Thanksgiving, lasts for just a short time, because I mean, there's no kind of incredible build up to it, and there's no sort of massive present giving, which is great. I mean, except of course if you're invited, you take a very nice bottle of wine, I can assure you. But there's much less of a fuss in that way. But in one way, in Britain, Christmas really, I mean, quite a lot of people take 2 weeks off, so it lasts for 2 weeks. Whereas in America, you have Christmas Day, and that's it. You don't have any Boxing Day. You're straight back to work. Whereas with Thanksgiving now, I mean, it's Thursday, Friday, and the weekend. So in terms of, Christmas lasts longer in one way, if you like, but Thanksgiving lasts longer in another way. And I'm quite interested in whether people think that, which is kind of more important. Well, obviously, we don't have Thanksgiving here in Britain, it's Christmas. But in America, I mean, I do get the feeling that, that Christmas, because of the long build-up, is getting, more and more of a sort of, not exactly kind of preeminence, but, it's getting sort of more and more attention really in America. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, definitely. I think I think every year you see more and more of that. And what's interesting about here in England is that because there is no Thanksgiving, sometimes the build up to Christmas can start after Halloween. So from the 1st of November.
Yeah.
So maybe it's because you feel that build up more here because you don't have something like Thanksgiving that's in the middle, essentially. Yeah. But I do think that every year it's becoming kind of more commercialized, and you hear the songs earlier and the traditions start earlier, and but I don't think necessarily a bad thing. It just
well, again, I mean,
but not everybody.
Go on, Scary. Sorry, go on.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, but basically, I mean, it's, as I said, I mean, it's something to look forward to. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's really sort of some people. Actually, I've noticed it in this road that people seem to have put out their Christmas decorations rather earlier this year than normally.
Well, it's definitely something to look forward to. And unfortunately, we're out of time. But thank you so much, George, for joining us for this December edition of that.
Thank you very much indeed, Caitlin.
And I hope that everyone here has happy holidays, no matter what you celebrate. And we hope that you enjoyed this. We will have this recording available on our website, www.benjaminfranklinhouse.org. We are making these talks available for free. So if you are in the giving spirit and are able to, we'd appreciate any kind of donation. And of course, you can buy George's book, Christmas traditions, we have the links on the website as well. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.